The harsh wind carried the sound of the auctioneer's voice across Abilene's dusty Main Street, where a crowd had gathered for the most unusual sale Crawford County, Kansas had seen in years. Amelia Fletcher clutched her 6-month-old son James to her chest, her once fine dress now worn and faded, as she stood trembling on the wooden platform outside the county courthouse. The summer of 1874 had brought drought to the plains, desperation to its people, and the cruelest of fates to the young widow. What am I bid for this fine woman and her healthy boy? County's got her recoup the burial costs for her husband and settle his outstanding debts. She cooks, she cleans, she can mend your clothes and raise your young uns. The auctioneer, a portly man with yellowed teeth and no conscience, gestured toward Amelia as if she were livestock. Contract of servitude for 5 years. You won't find a better deal in all of Kansas. Amelia blinked back tears. Just 3 months ago, she'd been happily married to Thomas Fletcher, a shopkeeper with dreams of prosperity in this frontier town. Then the typhoid fever had swept through, taking Thomas in less than a week, leaving behind nothing but debts and a grief so profound Amelia could barely breathe through it some days. The crowd murmured, sizing her up with calculating eyes. Some of the women looked away, unable to witness another woman's humiliation. The men were less discreet with their evaluations. $20, called a voice from the back. 25, countered another. 30 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer announced with growing enthusiasm. Do I hear 35? The bidding continued, each call driving a stake deeper into Amelia's heart. Little James began to fuss, as if sensing his mother's distress. She bounced him gently, whispering soothing words she herself didn't believe. $50 from Mr. Gunderson. The auctioneer pointed to a weathered farmer known for working his hired hands to exhaustion. Amelia had heard whispers about how he treated the women in his household. $50 going once. A dust cloud appeared at the far end of the street, $50 going twice. The pounding of hooves grew louder as a rider approached at a gallop. Sold to wait. A deep voice called out as a chestnut stallion slid to a halt at the edge of the crowd. The gathering parted as a tall man dismounted in one fluid motion. His face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but his posture exuded confidence as he strode toward the auction platform. Amelia clutched James tighter, unsure if this newcomer represented salvation or yet another threat. The stranger pushed his way through the onlookers, boots kicking up dust with each determined step. He stopped at the foot of the platform, tilted his hat back, and for the first time, Amelia saw his face clearly strong-jawed, weather-beaten, with eyes the color of a summer storm. "I'll take them," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "Sir, the bidding is at $50. The stranger reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. "I've got 75. He tossed it onto the platform, where it landed with a heavy clink of coins. "And who might you be, mister?" The auctioneer eyed him suspiciously. "Name's Blake Sullivan." He looked up at Amelia, his gaze softening slightly when it fell upon the baby in her arms. "And I reckon this isn't right, auctioning off a woman and her child like they're cattle." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Amelia stared at the man, unable to comprehend why a stranger would intervene on her behalf. His clothes marked him as a cowboy, worn leather vest over a simple shirt, dusty trousers tucked into scuffed boots, and a gun belt that had seen its share of use. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, your concern is noted, but this here is county business. The woman's husband left debts that need settling. Then I'm settling them." Blake's hand rested casually near his holster, not a threat, but a reminder. $75 should cover it with some to spare. The county clerk, a thin man who'd been documenting the proceedings, stepped forward. The highest bid was $50. $75 will indeed cover the outstanding amount. The auctioneer looked displeased but nodded. Sold to Mr. Sullivan for $75. Relief flooded through Amelia, quickly followed by apprehension. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted from her. As the clerk prepared the necessary paperwork, Blake Sullivan approached the platform steps. "Madam," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I don't mean to frighten you. I'm not looking for a servant or—" He hesitated, glancing at the baby. "Anything improper. I've got a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town. There's a cabin on the property where you and your boy can stay until you get back on your feet." Amelia found her voice at last. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." A shadow of something pain perhaps crossed his face before he replied. "No, madam, I don't. But I know what it's like to be at the mercy of others. No one should have to stand where you're standing." The clerk approached with papers for Blake to sign. As he did so, Amelia studied him more carefully. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22 years. Despite his rugged appearance, there was something in the way he handled himself, a gentleness that belied his weathered exterior. After signing, Blake turned back to her. "If you'd prefer to stay in town, I understand. I can arrange something else." "No," Amelia said quickly, surprising herself with her decision. I think we'd be better off away from here for a while." Away from the pitying stares and whispers that had followed her since Thomas's death, Blake nodded and offered his hand to help her down from the platform. His touch was warm and steady as she descended the steps with James secure in her other arm. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, but Amelia could feel their curious glances following her. "My wagon's just down the street," Blake said. "We should get your belongings." "They're at the boarding house," she replied softly. "There isn't much." They walked in silence, an unusual trio making their way down Abilene's Main Street. At the boarding house, the landlady, Mrs. Whittaker, met them at the door with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "Heard about the auction," she said, eyeing Blake. "Glad to see you found a solution, Mrs. Fletcher." "Mr. Sullivan has offered us a place to stay," Amelia explained, her chin lifted with what dignity she could muster. Mrs. Whittaker's expression softened slightly. "The Sullivan Ranch." "Well, that's something. Your husband was an honorable man, Mr. Sullivan," she said to Blake. "Rest his soul." Amelia noticed Blake's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, madam. I'm just trying to do right, Mrs. Whittaker allowed them upstairs, where Amelia quickly gathered her meager possessions, a few dresses, baby clothes, a photograph of Thomas, and the silver hairbrush that had been her mother's. Everything fit into a single trunk. As Blake carried it downstairs, Mrs. Whittaker pulled Amelia aside. "Be careful, dear. I don't know much about the younger Sullivan, but his father was well respected. Still, you're in a delicate position." "I don't have many options, Mrs. Whittaker," Amelia whispered. "I know that, child. Just keep your wits about you." Outside, Blake had loaded her trunk onto a simple wagon and helped her climb up to the seat, waiting until she was settled with James before climbing up himself. With a click of his tongue, he set the horses in motion, leaving Abilene behind. The Kansas plains stretched out before them, golden in the late afternoon sun. Amelia felt a strange mix of terror and relief as the town receded behind them. She had no idea what awaited her at the Sullivan Ranch, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel completely helpless. "Your son," Blake said after they'd traveled in silence for some time. "What's his name?" "James," she answered, looking down at the now sleeping baby. James Thomas Fletcher, Blake nodded. A good name. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving her space despite their physical proximity on the wagon seat. Your father, Amelia ventured. Mrs. Whittaker mentioned him. Blake's hands tightened on the reins. He passed last winter pneumonia. I'm sorry. Been running the ranch alone since then. It's not much 60 acres, about 30 head of cattle, but it's paid for. He glanced at her briefly. The cabin I mentioned was my father's. I built a new house a couple years back, thought he'd move into it, but he preferred his old place. And you live in the new house alone. Just me and a ranch hand named Pedro. He's got a small place of his own on the property. Blake seemed to sense her concern. The cabin's far enough from the main house that you'll have your privacy, Mrs. Fletcher. Amelia, she said softly. Please call me Amelia. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Amelia, then. They continued on as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Amelia felt James stir against her chest and shifted him to her other arm. We can stop if you need to tend to him, Blake offered. He'll be all right for now, she assured him, though her arms were growing tired. She'd been holding James almost constantly since they'd been forced from their home above Thomas's shop. Blake seemed to sense her fatigue. We'll be there soon. There's a stream not far from the cabin, good water. The place is simple but sound. My father kept it in good repair. Amelia nodded, grateful for the information but unsure what her role would be. Mr. Sullivan, Blake, he corrected. Blake, I want to thank you for what you did today, but I need to understand what you expect from me. I can cook and clean, of course, and I'm handy with a needle, but I don't expect anything, he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. Like I said, the cabin is yours until you decide what's next for you and your boy. You're not indentured to me or anyone else. Amelia studied his profile, trying to reconcile his generosity with her experience of the world. People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return. Blake was quiet for a long moment. My mother died when I was about your boy's age. My father raised me alone. It wasn't easy for him. He cleared his throat. I reckon if someone had given him a helping hand, things might have been different. There was more to the story, Amelia sensed, but she didn't press. They were both carrying their own burdens of grief. The wagon crested a small rise and Blake pointed ahead. There it is, Sullivan Ranch. Amelia followed his gaze to a modest valley below. A two-story farmhouse stood near a large barn with a corral and several outbuildings nearby. About a quarter-mile away, she could see a smaller structure, the cabin, presumably. A thin ribbon of water cut through the property, catching the golden light of the setting sun. It's lovely, she said, and meant it. After months of uncertainty and fear, the peaceful scene before her brought an unexpected lump to her throat. Blake guided the wagon down the slope and past the main house. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, short and wiry with a weathered brown face. He waved at their approach. That's Pedro, Blake explained. Been with the ranch since before I was born. Pedro approached as Blake brought the wagon to a halt. His dark eyes took in Amelia and the baby with unconcealed curiosity. Pedro, this is Mrs. Fletcher and her son James. They'll be staying in my father's cabin for a while. Pedro nodded respectfully. Senora, welcome. Is very peaceful here for you and the niño. Thank you, Amelia replied, warmed by his genuine welcome. Blake handed the reins to Pedro and jumped down from the wagon, coming around to help Amelia. She carefully passed James to him while she climbed down, surprised by how naturally he held the baby. James blinked up at the stranger holding him but didn't fuss. He likes you, Amelia observed as she took him back. Babies are good judges of character, they say. Blake offered a small smile before retrieving her trunk. Let's get you settled. They walked the short distance to the cabin, which grew more appealing as they approached. It was small but solid, with a porch across the front and curtains visible in the windows. Blake set down her trunk to open the door, then carried it inside. Amelia followed, stepping into a surprisingly cozy space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a small kitchen area opposite. A rocking chair sat near the hearth, and a table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room. 2 doors presumably led to bedrooms. "It's not fancy," Blake said, setting her trunk down, "but it's clean. Pedro's been keeping an eye on the place." "It's wonderful," Amelia whispered, overwhelmed by the simple comfort it offered after months of uncertainty. Blake moved efficiently around the cabin, lighting a lamp and showing her the bedrooms, one larger with a double bed, the other smaller with a single bed that could serve as James's room when he was older. He pointed out the pantry, stocked with basic provisions, and the woodpile behind the house. "The pump outside brings up good water. There's a washtub in the lean-to out back." He hesitated. "Outhouse is just beyond that. I could build you a proper bath if you'd like when you're settled." Amelia nodded, still trying to process everything. "This is more than I could have hoped for." Blake seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll leave you to get settled. Come up to the main house for breakfast tomorrow if you'd like, around 7, or I can bring something down if you prefer." "I'll come up," Amelia said. "We don't want to be a bother. You're not." His eyes met hers briefly before he looked away. "I'll be going then. There's a bar on the door and, well, you're safe here, but use it anyway if it makes you feel better." He left before she could thank him again, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he walked back toward the main house. Amelia stood in the doorway watching him go, James heavy in her arms. "Well, James," she whispered to her son, "it seems we've found a guardian angel, or at least a good man." She looked around at the cabin that would be their sanctuary. "Let's make the most of it, shall we?" The next morning dawned clear and bright. Amelia had slept better than she had in months, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. James had only woken twice for feeding, and the quiet of the countryside had been a balm to her frayed nerves after the constant noise of the boarding house. She dressed in one of her better dresses, faded but clean, and pinned her honey-brown hair up neatly. After feeding and changing James, she wrapped him in a shawl and started the walk toward the main house, watching the early morning activity of the ranch around her. Pedro was already at work in the corral with a young colt. He waved as she passed. Near the barn, another man she hadn't met was forking hay into a wagon. The main house was larger up close than it had appeared from a distance, 2 stories of well-maintained clapboard with a wide porch wrapping around 2 sides. Amelia hesitated at the steps, suddenly unsure of herself. But before she could decide whether to knock, the door opened and Blake appeared. He'd clearly been up for hours but had cleaned up, his dark hair still damp from washing. "Good morning," he said, seeming genuinely pleased to see her. "Come in. Coffee's hot." The kitchen was spacious and surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's home. A large table dominated the center, with a cast-iron stove against one wall and open shelves displaying plates and cooking implements. "Did you sleep well?" Blake asked as he poured her a cup of coffee. "Better than I have in a long time," Amelia admitted, settling James more comfortably in her arms. "The cabin is perfect. Thank you again." Blake shrugged off her thanks and gestured toward the stove. "I'm not much of a cook, but there's eggs and bacon. And biscuits, though I won't vouch for their quality." "I'd be happy to cook," Amelia offered. "It's the least I can do." Blake looked as if he might refuse, then nodded. "If you wouldn't mind, I'll hold the little one." To Amelia's surprise, he reached for James, who went to him without protest. Blake settled the baby in the crook of his arm with practiced ease while Amelia set about preparing breakfast. She found butter and preserves in a small pantry, along with flour and cornmeal. "You keep a well-stocked kitchen for a bachelor," she observed as she worked. Blake gently bounced James, who was fascinated by the man's shirt buttons. "My father taught me that empty bellies make for poor work. We feed our hands well, especially during roundup and branding." "Is that what's happening now? I noticed the extra man outside." "That's Hank. He helps out sometimes when we need an extra pair of hands. We're getting ready to drive some cattle to the railhead in Abilene next week." Amelia cracked eggs into a bowl. "Will you be gone long?" "4 or 5 days, if the weather holds." Blake studied her face. "Will you be all right here alone?" "Pedro will stay behind to keep an eye on things." "We'll be fine," Amelia assured him, touched by his concern. She quickly finished preparing the meal and set plates on the table. Blake placed James in a wooden crate lined with a blanket, a makeshift cradle, before joining her at the table. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke again. "I don't mean to pry, but I was wondering about your situation." Before Amelia set down her fork. "Thomas, my husband, owned a dry goods store in Abilene. We'd been married just over a year when I became pregnant with James. Business was good and we were happy." She paused, the familiar grief washing over her. "Then the fever came through town. Thomas was gone within days." Blake's eyes held genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry. After he died, I discovered he'd borrowed money to expand the store. The creditors took everything: the store, our home above it, even most of our personal belongings. I tried to find work, but with a newborn." She trailed off. "The county had paid for Thomas's burial when I couldn't. Eventually, they decided to recoup their costs and settle his other debts by—" She couldn't finish. "By selling your labor," Blake finished grimly. "It's not right." "No," Amelia agreed, "but the law allows it. Women have few rights on their own, especially widows with debts." Blake's jaw tightened. "The law and what's right aren't always the same thing." James began to fuss, saving Amelia from having to respond. She rose to tend to him, and the conversation shifted to more immediate concerns: supplies she might need, the approaching summer heat, the garden behind the cabin that had gone untended since Blake's father died. As she prepared to leave after breakfast, Blake walked her to the door. "I need to ride into town today for supplies. Is there anything specific you need?" Amelia hesitated. "Some cloth for diapers, perhaps. James is growing so quickly. Consider it done." Blake cleared his throat. "If you'd like, I can see about your husband's grave while I'm there. Make sure it's being tended properly." The unexpected kindness brought tears to Amelia's eyes. "I would appreciate that. I haven't been able to visit since we left our home." Blake nodded, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "I'll be back before sundown. Pedro knows where to find everything if you need anything." Amelia returned to the cabin with a lighter heart than she'd had in months. As she set about making it more like home, arranging her few possessions and airing out linens, she found herself wondering about Blake Sullivan. His generosity went beyond mere charity. There was something in his manner, a kind of lonely understanding that suggested he knew more about loss than he let on. That evening, Blake returned from town with not only the diaper cloth she'd requested, but also a length of pretty calico, a bag of hard candies, and a small wooden toy for James. He reported that Thomas's grave was well kept, in a quiet corner of the cemetery with a simple marker. "I left some wildflowers," he said, almost apologetically. "Didn't know what he might have liked." "That was very thoughtful," Amelia said, touched by the gesture. "Thomas always appreciated the simple things. He would have liked wildflowers." They established a routine over the next few days. Amelia would come up to the main house in the mornings to prepare breakfast for Blake and his ranch hands. She'd return to the cabin with James during the heat of the day, then often join Blake again for a simple supper. In the evenings, sometimes Blake would visit the cabin, sitting on the porch with her as darkness fell, talking about the day's work or his plans for the ranch. The night before he was to leave for the cattle drive, he seemed particularly restless. They sat on the cabin porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass as James slept inside. "You should be able to find everything you need in the pantry," Blake said, going over details they'd already discussed. "And Pedro will check on you daily. If there's any trouble at all, Blake," Amelia interrupted gently, "we'll be fine. You've made sure of that." He ran a hand through his hair. "I know, it's just—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to articulate his concern. "You've done more for us than anyone had reason to expect," Amelia said softly. "We'll be here when you get back." Blake studied her face in the fading light. "Will you? I've been wondering if you might be planning to move on once you've had some time to recover." The question caught Amelia off guard. She hadn't thought much beyond day-to-day survival since Thomas died. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't made any plans." Blake nodded, looking out at the darkening landscape. "Whatever you decide, the cabin is yours for as long as you need it." They sat in companionable silence until the stars emerged in full brilliance above them. Finally, Blake stood to leave. "I should let you get some rest. We'll be starting before dawn." "Be careful," Amelia said, rising as well. Blake hesitated, then reached out and briefly touched her hand. "I'll see you in a few days." She watched him walk back toward the main house, a tall silhouette against the starlit prairie. For the first time since Thomas's death, Amelia felt a flutter of something other than grief in her heart, something that felt dangerously like hope. The days of Blake's absence passed slowly. True to his word, Pedro checked on her regularly, bringing fresh milk from the ranch's cow and occasionally staying to repair small things around the cabin. Amelia used the time to deep clean the cabin, plant some vegetable seeds in the neglected garden, and sew a new dress from the calico Blake had brought. On the fourth day, she was hanging laundry on a line behind the cabin when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Blake riding toward her, his horse dusty from the trail. Something leaped in her chest at the sight of him, a feeling both welcome and frightening in its intensity. He dismounted and approached, removing his hat. 4 days in the sun had darkened his already tanned skin, and stubble shadowed his jaw. "You're back early," Amelia said, trying to keep her voice casual. The drive went smoother than expected. His eyes moved over her face as if checking that she was truly all right. "How have you and James been?" "Wonderful. I've started the garden again, though it's late in the season." Blake smiled. "I noticed. It looks good." He glanced toward the cabin. "Is he sleeping?" "Just went down for his nap." Amelia hung the last of James's diapers on the line. "Are you hungry?" "I could fix something." "I'd appreciate that. Let me take care of my horse first." By the time Blake returned, Amelia had prepared a simple meal of cornbread and bean stew she'd had simmering all morning. They ate at the small table in the cabin, Blake telling her about the cattle drive and the good price they'd fetched in Abilene. "I brought something for you," he said when they'd finished eating. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much." Amelia untied the string and opened it to find a beautiful hairbrush and comb set, made of polished wood with a subtle floral design. "Blake, it's lovely, but you shouldn't spend your money on gifts for me." "The cattle brought a good price," he said simply. "And I noticed your old brush was losing its bristles." The thoughtfulness of the gift, that he'd noticed such a small detail about her daily life, touched Amelia deeply. "Thank you." James woke then, his cries coming from the bedroom. Amelia went to get him, returning with the sleepy baby in her arms. Blake's face softened at the sight of them. "He's grown even in just these few days," he observed, Children do that, Amelia smiled. Especially at this age. Blake hesitated, then asked, "May I hold him?" Amelia placed James in his arms, and the baby immediately grabbed for Blake's bandana. Blake laughed, a rich sound that Amelia realized she'd rarely heard from him. "He likes bright colors," Amelia explained, "and he's starting to reach for everything these days." "Smart boy," Blake said, letting James tug on the bandana. "Takes after his mama." The compliment brought warmth to Amelia's cheeks. For a moment, watching Blake with her son, she could almost imagine they were a real family. The thought both comforted and frightened her. As spring turned to summer, Amelia and James became fixtures at the Sullivan Ranch. The garden behind the cabin flourished under Amelia's care, producing vegetables that supplemented their meals. She took over most of the cooking for Blake and his hands, often preparing food at the main house, but sometimes bringing it from her own kitchen. James grew stronger each day, beginning to roll over and sit up, his personality emerging in bright smiles and curious exploration. Blake seemed fascinated by the baby's development, often stopping by the cabin in the evenings just to see what new skill James had mastered. One sweltering July afternoon, Amelia was in the main house kitchen, preparing supper while James played on a blanket on the floor. Blake had been out since dawn, riding the boundaries of his property, checking fences and water sources. She heard the door open and turned, expecting to see him, but instead found Pedro's wife Maria, who sometimes helped with household tasks. "Señora Amelia," Maria said, her expression serious. "Blake has returned. He is injured." Amelia's heart lurched. "Injured? How badly?" The horse stepped in a hole, threw him against some rocks. "His arm is broken, I think, and he has cuts on his head." Amelia quickly dried her hands. "Is he at the doctor's?" "No, he is too stubborn." "He is in his room, letting Pedro and Hank help him." Maria's disapproval was clear. "Perhaps you can talk sense to him." Amelia had never been upstairs in the main house. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, uncertain of her place, but concern for Blake overcame her hesitation. She climbed the steps, James on her hip, and found Pedro and Hank just leaving a room at the end of the hallway. "Ah, Señora," Pedro said when he saw her. "Good, maybe he will listen to you. He needs a doctor, but he refuses." "How bad is it?" Amelia asked. "The arm is broken for sure." "He has a cut on his head that needs stitching, and he may have broken ribs also. He is in much pain but won't admit it." Amelia nodded. "I'll talk to him." She entered the room to find Blake sitting on the edge of a large bed, his shirt off, trying awkwardly to clean a gash on his temple with his left hand. His right arm hung at an unnatural angle, already swelling and bruising. Various cuts and abrasions marked his chest and back. He looked up when she entered, clearly surprised. "Amelia, you shouldn't be in here." "Don't be ridiculous," she replied, setting James on a rug near the wall with a wooden spoon to keep him occupied. "You're hurt and you're being stubborn. It's not that bad." Amelia took the cloth from his hand and gently cleaned the head wound. "Your arm is clearly broken. This cut needs stitches, and from the way you're breathing, I suspect your ribs are at least cracked." Blake winced as she touched a particularly tender spot. "I've had worse." "That's not reassuring." She examined the head wound more closely. "You need a doctor, Blake," he sighed. "Town's 15 miles away. By the time someone goes to fetch Dr. Miller and brings him back, it'll be dark. The arm can wait until morning." Amelia frowned but recognized the practical truth of his statement. "Then at least let me do what I can. I helped care for wounded soldiers during the war when I was a girl. My father was a doctor." Blake looked surprised. "You never mentioned that. You never asked." She moved to the basin of water on the dresser. "I need clean bandages, whiskey, and something to use as a splint for your arm." Blake nodded toward a cabinet. "Whiskey's in there. Pedro already brought bandages. There's a box of medical supplies in the bottom drawer of the dresser. My father kept it well stocked." Amelia worked efficiently, cleaning his wounds thoroughly before addressing the broken arm. "This will hurt," she warned as she prepared to set it. Blake nodded, bracing himself. He grunted in pain but remained still as she manipulated the bone back into alignment, then splinted and wrapped it securely. Next, she cleaned and bandaged his other injuries, including the head wound which, upon closer inspection, wasn't deep enough to require stitches after all. Finally, she wrapped his ribs tightly with long strips of bandage. Throughout her ministrations, Blake watched her face, his expression a mixture of pain and something more complex. "Where did you learn to do all this?" he asked as she tied off the last bandage. "When I was 12, the war came through our town in Missouri. My father turned our home into a makeshift hospital for a while. I helped where I could." She wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "I never had his gift for medicine, but I learned the basics." "You have a healer's touch," Blake said softly. "Gentle but firm." Amelia felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. She became acutely aware of their situation. Blake half-dressed on his bed, her hands having just moved intimately over his body, albeit in a medical context. She stepped back, creating distance between them. "You should rest now. I'll bring you something to eat later, and tomorrow we'll get the doctor to check my work." Blake caught her hand before she could turn away. "Thank you, Amelia." The sincerity in his voice held her in place. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then James made a loud noise, breaking the spell, and Amelia pulled her hand free. "Rest," she said again, moving to pick up her son. "Doctor's orders." The doctor arrived the following day, confirmed that Amelia had done an excellent job with Blake's injuries, and prescribed rest for at least 2 weeks. Blake chafed under the restriction, unused to inactivity, but his injuries left him little choice. Amelia took on more responsibilities around the ranch, coordinating with Pedro to ensure the necessary work was done while Blake recovered. She spent considerable time in the main house, bringing meals to Blake and helping him with tasks made difficult by his injured arm. Their conversations grew longer and more personal during these quiet moments, as if Blake's physical vulnerability had lowered some emotional barrier between them. One evening, as Amelia sat in a chair beside his bed, darning socks while Blake read a book one-handed, he suddenly asked, "Do you miss him very much?" "Your husband?" The question caught her by surprise. "Yes," she answered honestly, "but differently now than at first. The sharp pain has faded to something more manageable." She set aside her darning. "I miss the future we planned more than anything, the life we thought we'd have." Blake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I never married," he said after a moment. "Came close once, but she chose someone else, a banker with prospects better than a cattleman with dirt under his fingernails." "Her loss," Amelia said without thinking. Blake's eyes met hers, a spark of something warming their gray depths. "Maybe so." The air between them felt charged suddenly, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Amelia rose from her chair, flustered by her own reaction to him. "It's getting late. James will be waking for his feeding." Blake set aside his book. "Of course. Thank you for the company." At the door, Amelia paused and looked back at him. "For what it's worth, I think you have more to offer than any banker I've ever met." His smile followed her all the way back to the cabin. As summer progressed, Blake's injuries healed and the rhythm of life on the ranch returned to normal. Yet something had changed between them, a new awareness that manifested in lingering glances and conversations that stretched late into the evening. Neither of them acknowledged it directly. as if putting it into words might somehow break the delicate balance they'd established. One August evening, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Blake finally broached the subject that had been hovering between them. "Have you given any more thought to your plans?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It's been nearly 3 months since you came here." James was crawling on a blanket at their feet, exploring the smooth wooden boards of the porch. Amelia watched him for a moment before answering. "I've been thinking about it," she admitted. "I have some money saved now, from the eggs and vegetables I've been selling in town. Enough perhaps for a small room somewhere until I can find steady work." Blake's face remained impassive, but she noticed his hand tighten on the arm of his chair. "You don't have to leave." "I meant what I said. The cabin is yours for as long as you need it. I can't live on your charity forever, Blake." "It's not charity." He turned to look directly at her. "Having you and James here, it's made this place feel like a home again. Since my father died, it's just been a ranch. A place to work, but now—" He trailed off, seeming unable to find the right words. Amelia's heart beat faster. "Blake, what are you saying?" He stood and moved to the porch railing, his back to her. "I'm not good with words, Amelia, never have been, but I hope you know how I feel about you. About James, too." Amelia rose and joined him at the railing, close enough to feel the warmth of his body but not touching. "Tell me anyway." Blake turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I love you, both of you. I think I started falling for you that first day in town, seeing you standing so brave on that auction platform with your baby in your arms." The confession stole Amelia's breath. She'd suspected, hoped even, but hearing the words made everything suddenly, frighteningly real. "You don't have to say anything now," Blake continued quickly. "I know it hasn't been that long since you lost your husband. I know you may not feel—" Amelia placed her fingers gently against his lips, silencing him. "I love Thomas," she said softly. "Part of me always will. But my heart isn't as fixed as I once thought. These past months, watching you with James, seeing your kindness and your strength. I've fallen in love with you too, Blake Sullivan." The relief and joy that washed over his face made him look younger, unburdened. He reached for her slowly, as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly, and drew her into his arms. "I never thought I'd find this," he murmured against her hair. "Someone to share my life with, a family." "Is that what you want? A family?" Amelia asked, her heart full but cautious. Blake pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "More than anything, I want to be a father to James if you'll let me, and maybe someday give him brothers and sisters." Tears blurred Amelia's vision. "I'd like that very much." Blake lowered his head, hesitating just before his lips met hers, giving her a chance to pull away. Instead, Amelia closed the distance between them, sealing their confessions with a kiss that felt like coming home. A cry from James broke them apart, both laughing as they turned to find the baby had crawled to the edge of the blanket and was protesting his limited domain. "He's getting more mobile every day," Blake observed as Amelia picked James up. "Soon he'll be walking," she agreed, settling the baby on her hip. "They grow so quickly at this age." Blake's expression turned serious again. "Amelia, I know this might seem sudden, but I don't want to wait. Will you marry me? Make this arrangement permanent. I want to give James my name, make him my son in the eyes of the law as well as my heart." The proposal, though not unexpected after their confessions, still took Amelia's breath away. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Blake's smile was radiant as he pulled a small object from his pocket, a simple gold ring with a single small diamond. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. It was my mother's." Amelia gasped as he slipped it onto her finger. It's beautiful. Like you, he said, then laughed self-consciously. Listen to me. Next thing you know, I'll be writing poetry. I wouldn't go that far, Amelia teased, her heart so full it felt it might burst. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Abilene, with Pedro and Maria as witnesses, and James dressed in a new outfit Blake had ordered from the mercantile. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, the small gathering of ranch hands and townsfolk, genuinely happy for the couple whose unusual beginning had blossomed into something beautiful. As they drove back to the ranch afterward, now officially husband and wife, Amelia leaned against Blake's shoulder. "I never expected this," she admitted. "When I stood on that auction platform, I thought my life was over." Blake's arm tightened around her. "And I never expected to find my future when I rode into town that day. Funny how life works out sometimes." "You believe in fate?" Amelia asked, watching the familiar landscape of their home appear on the horizon. Blake considered the question seriously. "I believe that good people deserve happiness, and that sometimes the world arranges itself to make that happen. I'm just grateful it arranged you and James into my life." The ranch looked different to Amelia as they approached it, now not as a temporary refuge, but as her permanent home. Blake had suggested they move into the main house together, converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery for James. The cabin would remain available for guests or perhaps, someday, for ranch hands with families of their own. That night, after James was asleep in his new nursery, Blake and Amelia stood on the porch of their home, arms around each other as they gazed at the star-filled Kansas sky. "Happy?" Blake asked, his voice a gentle rumble in his chest. "More than I thought possible," Amelia answered truthfully. His kiss was a promise of all the days to come, days filled with work and laughter, challenges and joys, the building of a life together on this patch of prairie they both now called home. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in late October. The Sullivan Ranch was prepared. The cattle moved to sheltered pastures, the barns filled with hay, the house stocked with preserved vegetables from Amelia's garden and meat from the autumn slaughter. Amelia stood at the kitchen window, watching the snowflakes swirl in the gray morning light, a cup of hot coffee warming her hands. Behind her, Blake sat at the table, James on his lap, attempting to feed the now 10-month-old boy porridge with limited success. "More is going on his clothes than in his mouth," Blake observed, wiping a glob from James's chin. Amelia smiled, turning from the window. "He's determined to feed himself, even if he doesn't quite have the coordination yet." "Stubborn like his mama," Blake teased. "I prefer to call it persistent," Amelia countered, setting her coffee down and taking over the feeding duties. James immediately grabbed for the spoon, sending porridge flying. "And I think he gets it from both of us," Blake chuckled, rising to wash his hands at the basin. "Fair point." He dried his hands and came to stand behind her, placing a gentle kiss on the top of her head. "I need to check on the north pasture today. Pedro thinks some of the young heifers might have strayed during the night." "Be careful," Amelia said, looking up at him. "The weather could turn worse." "I won't be long," he promised. "And I'll take the good coat you insist is too warm until it's actually needed." She smiled at his gentle mockery of her worrying. 3 months of marriage had taught them the rhythms of each other's concerns, the ways they expressed love through practical care. Blake kissed her properly before bundling up and heading out into the cold, leaving Amelia and James to their morning routine. By midday, the snow had stopped, leaving 6 inches of pristine white covering the landscape. Amelia had just put James down for his nap when she heard horses approaching. Moving to the window, she saw Blake and Pedro riding toward the house. Another horse in tow behind them, this one carrying what appeared to be a person wrapped in blankets. Amelia hurried outside as they reached the yard. "What's happened?" "Found her half frozen by the creek," Blake explained as he dismounted. "No horse, no supplies, just wandering." Pedro was already helping the bundled figure down from the horse. As the blankets fell away slightly, Amelia saw it was a young Native American woman, perhaps 17 or 18, her face drawn with cold and exhaustion. "Bring her inside, quickly," Amelia directed, leading the way. "She needs warmth and food." They settled the young woman by the fire in the sitting room, where Amelia wrapped her in fresh, dry blankets while Blake prepared hot coffee and Pedro brought in more firewood. The woman watched them with wary, dark eyes, but accepted the cup of coffee Amelia offered with trembling hands. "What's your name?" Amelia asked gently. The young woman hesitated before answering in careful English. "Tallulah. Tallulah, I'm Amelia. This is my husband Blake and our friend Pedro. You're safe here." Some of the tension eased from the girl's shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly. "What were you doing out there alone?" Blake asked, his tone concerned rather than accusatory. Tallulah's eyes filled with tears. "Running away. From reservation. Bad men there. White men who come at night, take young women." She shuddered. "I hide, but my friend, she was taken. I try to follow, but lose their trail. Then storm comes." Amelia and Blake exchanged troubled glances. Stories of abuse at the reservations weren't uncommon, but they were often dismissed by authorities. "Which reservation?" Blake asked. "Smoky Hill," Tallulah replied. 3 days' walk from here." Blake nodded grimly. "I know it. The agent there has a reputation for looking the other way when his men misbehave." "You'll stay with us until you're recovered," Amelia told Tallulah. "Then we'll figure out what's best." The girl's eyes widened. "You not send me back, no," Blake said firmly. "Not if it's not safe for you there." Relief washed over Tallulah's face, followed quickly by fatigue. Amelia helped her to the spare bedroom downstairs, where the exhausted girl fell asleep almost immediately. When she returned to the kitchen, Blake was sitting at the table, his expression troubled. "This could get complicated," he said quietly. "Legally, she's a ward of the government. Harboring her could be seen as a crime." "We can't send her back to that situation," Amelia said firmly. "I agree. But we need to be careful how we handle this." Blake ran a hand through his hair. "I'll ride to Abilene tomorrow, speak with Sheriff Davis. He's a good man, might have some advice." Amelia nodded. "In the meantime, she needs rest and care. I'll see to that." Over the next few days, Tallulah regained her strength. She was quiet but observant, watching Amelia care for James with particular interest. When Amelia asked about her family, Tallulah's face clouded. "All gone. Mother died when I was small. Father and brothers die in fighting with soldiers. Only me and grandmother left, but she died last winter." "I'm so sorry," Amelia said sincerely. Tallulah shrugged, a gesture that failed to hide her pain. "Many of my people have same story." Blake returned from Abilene with troubling news. The reservation agent had reported Tallulah missing and was demanding her return. Sheriff Davis had warned Blake to be careful. Harboring a runaway Indian could lead to serious charges. "What will we do?" Amelia asked that night after Tallulah had gone to bed. Blake paced the sitting room, firelight casting his shadow large against the wall. "I'm not sending her back to be abused, but I don't want to put you and James at risk either." Amelia considered the situation. What if she wasn't a runaway? What if she was working for us, legitimately? Blake stopped pacing. "You mean hire her, officially? Why not? She's good with James, and I could use the help around the house, especially as the ranch grows. If we had proper papers drawn up, a contract like any other employment arrangement." Blake nodded slowly, thinking it through. It might work. I'll talk to Judge Wilson when I'm next in town. He's fair-minded, might be willing to help us draft something that would stand up to scrutiny. They presented the idea to Talula the next morning. She listened carefully, then asked, "I would be servant." "An employee," Amelia corrected. "You would help me with James and the housework, and in return you would have a safe place to live, meals and wages of your own." "I would not have to go back. Not if you don't want to," Blake assured her. "It would be your choice." Talula's eyes filled with tears. "Then yes, I choose to stay." The arrangement was formalized through Judge Wilson, who drew up an employment contract that satisfied the legal requirements while protecting Talula's interests. The reservation agent protested, but could do little in the face of proper documentation and the judge's support. Talula proved to be a valuable addition to the household. She had a natural way with James, who adored her, and she quickly learned the workings of the ranch. Her knowledge of plants also expanded Amelia's garden, introducing native species that thrived in the Kansas soil. As winter gave way to spring, the Sullivan Ranch flourished. Blake's careful management had increased their herd, and the price of beef was strong. Amelia's garden expanded, providing not only for their table but also producing enough excess to sell in town. James took his first steps, toddling eagerly between Blake and Amelia, his delighted laughter filling the house. One warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Blake took Amelia's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, tracing his thumb over her palm, "about expanding the ranch." "In what way?" Amelia asked, curious. "The Henderson property to the east is for sale. Another 60 acres, good water access, and a small house that could be fixed up." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of buying it?" "I'm thinking we could offer it to Pedro and Maria." Blake smiled at her surprised expression. "They've been with this land longer than I have. Pedro's father worked for my grandfather. They deserve a place of their own while still being part of the ranch." "That's a wonderful idea," Amelia said warmly. "They would be so touched. And there's something else." Blake's expression turned more serious. "I've been saving to build a proper school on the ranch. Nothing fancy, just a one-room schoolhouse where the children of our workers could learn. Maybe even some of the native children from nearby, if their families were willing." Amelia's heart swelled with pride and love. "Blake Sullivan, just when I think I couldn't possibly love you more." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I want to build something that matters, Amelia. Not just a successful ranch, but a place where people are treated with dignity. Where children can grow up safe and learn, regardless of where they came from." "We'll build it together," Amelia promised, resting her head on his shoulder as the last rays of sunlight painted the prairie gold. The following spring brought new life to the Sullivan Ranch. The schoolhouse Blake had envisioned was completed just in time for the most important new arrival, a baby boy. They named Thomas Blake Sullivan. Born on a clear April morning with Dr. Miller in attendance and Talula assisting. Blake paced the hallway during the delivery, white-faced with worry until the baby's first cry rang out. When Dr. Miller finally allowed him in, he found Amelia propped up in bed, their new son cradled in her arms, James sitting beside her with wide, curious eyes. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and touching his son's tiny hand with a finger that seemed enormous by comparison. "He looks like you," Amelia said, smiling tiredly. "Same strong chin." Blake laughed softly. "Poor kid." James reached out to pat the baby's head with surprising gentleness. "Baby brother," he announced proudly, having been prepared for this moment for months. "That's right," Blake confirmed, putting his arm around his elder son. "You're a big brother now. That's an important job." As Amelia watched her family, the husband she'd found in such unlikely circumstances, the son who had kept her going through her darkest days, and now this new life they'd created together, she felt a sense of completion she'd never thought possible after Thomas's death. The Sullivan Ranch continued to grow and prosper. The schoolhouse Blake built served not only their own growing family, but also the children of their workers and eventually those from neighboring farms, and even a few from the nearby reservation. Amelia taught there 3 days a week, drawing on her education to provide the children with more than basic literacy. Pedro and Maria moved into the renovated house on the Henderson property, officially becoming partners in the ranch rather than employees. Tallulah remained with the Sullivans, eventually taking over most of the teaching duties at the school, her quiet strength and patience making her an excellent educator. 5 years after that fateful day in Abilene, Amelia stood on the porch of their home, watching Blake teach 7-year-old James to ride his own pony while 3-year-old Thomas toddled after them, determined not to be left behind. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their third child, a daughter, she was certain kicked vigorously. As if sensing her thoughts, Blake looked up and caught her eye, his face breaking into the warm smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He said something to James, who nodded seriously and continued practicing his riding under Pedro's watchful eye. Then Blake scooped up Thomas and made his way back to the house. "Everything all right?" he asked as he climbed the porch steps, settling Thomas on his hip. "Perfect," Amelia assured him, "just enjoying the view." Blake's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "It is a fine view." But he wasn't looking at the landscape, he was looking at her. "Mama, ride," Thomas demanded, reaching for her. "Not today, little man," Blake said gently. "Remember, Mama's carrying your baby sister." "Or brother," Amelia amended, though she remained convinced this child was a girl. "Either way, a blessing," Blake said, putting his free arm around her. "Another Sullivan to add to our family." Amelia leaned into his embrace, thinking of all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment: Thomas's death, her desperate circumstance, Blake's timely arrival at the auction, and all the choices they'd made since. Had any one of those things been different, this life they'd built together wouldn't exist. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Blake asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "About how easily we might never have met," she answered honestly. "How different our lives would be." Blake was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we would have found each other somehow," he said finally. "Some things are just meant to be." Amelia smiled up at him, this man who had saved her when she most needed saving and then given her the space and support to save herself. "I think you might be right." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber, the Sullivan family made their way inside their home. The house was full of the sounds of life: James chattering about his riding lesson, Thomas singing a made-up song, Tallulah setting the table for dinner, and Blake's deep laugh echoing through the rooms. Amelia paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, committing it to memory, this moment of perfect happiness in a life that had seen its share of sorrow. From the darkest day of her life on that auction platform to this warm evening surrounded by love, the journey hadn't been easy, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Blake glanced back, noticing her hesitation. "Coming, love." Amelia nodded, stepping fully into the warmth of their home. "Yes," she said, closing the door behind her. "I'm home." 3 months later, Amelia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose Sullivan, completing their family. The little girl had her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's storm-gray eyes, a perfect blend of them both. As the years passed, the Sullivan Ranch became known throughout Kansas, not just for the quality of its cattle, but for the way it was run with fairness, dignity, and opportunity for all who worked there. The school Blake and Amelia established eventually grew into a proper academy, drawing students from miles around, regardless of background or heritage. James grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's strength with his mother's compassion, eventually taking over much of the ranch management. Thomas developed a gift for working with horses that made him sought after throughout the territory. And Sarah, to no one's surprise, showed an aptitude for medicine that echoed her grandfather's calling, eventually studying to become one of Kansas's first female doctors. On warm summer evenings, Blake and Amelia still sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold, their hands intertwined as they had been since that first tentative touch so many years before. And sometimes, when the light was just right, Blake would look at Amelia and see traces of the brave young widow who had stood so proudly on that auction platform with her baby in her arms. "What are you thinking?" Amelia would ask, catching his gaze. And Blake would smile that still, after all these years, made her heart quicken. "That I'm the luckiest man in Kansas," he would answer. "The day I rode into Abilene and said I'd take you both was the best decision I ever made." "We took each other," Amelia would correct him gently, "and built something beautiful together." And in the golden light of the setting sun, with the sounds of their grown children and grandchildren drifting from the house behind them, they would share a kiss as sweet and promising as their first, a testament to the love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances and grown to shape not just their lives, but the lives of all who knew them.